Welcome to our third week of Reconnecting, which is probably the most exciting week so far. This week, we've finally gotten to the main subject of our series, which is prayer itself. But this is also the most challenging week so far because it's really going to challenge a lot of our assumptions or even things we've explicitly been taught about prayer. Because we use the word prayer in 101 different ways. And so often we can all be saying prayer, but we're all talking about different things. So this is a dumb example, but it's like you're talking to someone from England and you're both talking about football. Okay, but you're talking about picking up the ball and throwing it and carrying it, and they're looking at you like you're a freaking moron because you're not allowed to pick up the ball and carry it in football unless you're the goalie. And then you look at them and you're like, no, you're a moron, and you say that there's no goalie in football. And it's just round and round and round. So I hope that makes sense, but we're both saying the same word, but we're not talking about the same thing. So the first thing we need to do is, again, dive into these misconceptions, and then I'm going to give you a chance to discuss them. If you've lived a life like mine, one of the very tough lessons that you've learned, maybe even recently in your life, is that microwaves are amazing tools. They warm your food up real good, and they warm your spoon up real bad. So like, you leave your spoon in your coffee cup. It's a beautiful show, let me tell you. Don't look out in the garage. There's definitely not a broken microwave out there. It's a beautiful show, but it doesn't do that well. It's not what a microwave does. Also, another lesson that I had to learn the very hard way. I was a toddler at the time, so I don't fault myself too much. But we were at the orthodontist's office because my older siblings' teeth were real jacked up. And I was there in the waiting room with my mom, and I was playing with her keys. And that was the day that I found out that power outlets don't hold keys real well. I shot halfway across the waiting room. The best part of that story is the next day my mom gets a bouquet of flowers from the orthodontist, not me. It's just like, all right, they know who's going to sue you and who's not. So yeah, that was a great part. But again, what's going on is a microwave, a power outlet, that's not what those are for. That's not what those are. That's a duh thing for us. We know that. Microwaves don't warm up forks, power outlets don't hold keys. But when it comes to prayer, we very easily think that prayer is one thing, and we try so hard to make it be that thing, but it's just not that thing. It doesn't do that. It doesn't work that way. We can easily have some very strange ideas, some partial truths about what prayer is, and when that's the case, it's going to blow up in our face. One very common misunderstanding, and the reason we think these things are true is because there's partial truths. It's kind of true, and we just hold on to that part. We never get to... One of the false understandings of prayer is like a psychological activity. It's like meditation. Now, in the Christian tradition, there is a form of prayer called meditation. So meditation is a part and can be a part of prayer. Great. But prayer doesn't mean meditating. Another common one is in our prayer, we're supposed to empty our mind of every other single thought that we have, just black in our mind, just nothing. It's some sort of Buddhism. And again, that is sometimes a component of prayer, but that's not what prayer is. The most common one, as you've probably already thought of, is prayer is when we say our prayers. Prayer is when I do this, that starts prayer. Prayer is when I kneel down. Prayer is when that's what we think prayer is, saying our prayers. And then, of course, classic one is just, and we don't even think about it, but prayer is something that I do. That's simple. So since it's something that I do, it's something that is just, I need to get done each day. And that's when people will say to me, well, Father, I didn't have time to get it done yesterday. I didn't have time to pray. There's elements of truth to all these things, and they're going to be, we'll talk about that, but that's not what prayer is. That's not what it is in its essence. There's also weird expectations we carry into prayer. As good Americans, and our mentality when we enter into prayer is, well, if I'm going to give time to something, why do we use money? We always use money analogies. If I'm going to invest time in something, I need a good return on my time. If I'm going to give time, I need something back. And so that's when prayer turns into that sort of a transaction. As Americans, something's good if it feels good. So if I don't feel good when I'm praying, I either must be doing it wrong or I don't want to do this anymore. So again, all of these things, when this is how we think of prayer, that's what we think prayer is. It's like sticking a bunch of keys into the power outlet. No matter how hard you put the keys in, it's never going to work. It's not going to go well. So we can't just try harder to do any one of those things. That's not going to work. It's not going to do it. So when I think people give up on that battle of prayer, I think it's usually because they're not even fighting the right battle. They're still trying to get their microwave to warm up their spoon. So all of these are common misunderstandings and misconceptions of prayer. And like I mentioned, the reason that these are so prevalent is because they're so often elements of truth to them. Like, yeah, we do say prayers. Yes, prayer can involve meditation. But like we'll talk about in a bit, this is just incomplete. It's too one-sided. It's all about what we're doing. So yeah, we have a part to play, yes, but there's so much more. When we leave it at this, of course it's going to be very frustrating. Of course, like I hear it so often, prayer's a waste of time. But why? False ideas. So take a moment and get all these ideas that you have out on the table. Again, no shame. Just call them out. For many of us, we've been taught to say our prayers all our life. We've been told by parents and priests that we just need to say our prayers. And I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm simply saying that these understandings are often very incomplete. So just share, did you resonate with some of these false understandings of prayer? If so, which ones? Why? And where have you experienced the greatest frustration in prayer? And was it linked maybe to some of these false understandings? Prayer is so simple. We're making it very complicated. Prayer is something very simple. It's not always easy to experience true prayer, but it's very simple. And in order to experience it, we're going to need just simply three things. We need, we need humility. We're going to need some trust. And then we're going to need some perseverance. Did anybody listen to the gospel today? No? Yes? Okay, good. In the gospel today, we see precisely that. Okay. In the gospel, here comes this leper. A leper is an outcast. No one likes the lepers because they're very contagious. So they live outside of town. But this leper, in great humility, recognizing how terrible it is for him to walk into town, in great humility, he still comes to Jesus. But then he also comes to him with great faith. Because what does he ask Jesus? Exactly. He doesn't ask him anything. It was a trick question. He doesn't ask him anything. He just says, if you will it, you can make me clean. Doesn't even ask him. He just says, amen, guess what? If you will it, I can be made clean. So he just trusts what Jesus can do. And then he perseveres. He just waits until Jesus does something. Okay, humility, trust, and perseverance. If you know, I've told you this before, I really only have 2 homilies. I repackage them really differently. Just say 2 things week after week, which is a need for humility. We need to recognize who we are. Sometimes we need conversion, right? That's where all of our conversion comes in, metanoia. Big one for me is talking about humility. But then my other homily is the homily of faith, of trust, getting the wheelbarrow, right? It's classic stuff I say all the time. But then, if you ever go to confession, classic thing that I'll tell you is little by little, day after day, we just keep going. So what I always talk about, the only things I really talk about are humility, trust, faith, and perseverance. That's what we need. It's the dumb cello example that I give. Right? I can't just pick up a cello and play it. I can't just get a really hard piece of music and be like, well, I can play this because I want to. No. In order to play a musical instrument, it takes a lot of humility. Week after week, my teacher would remind me of how terrible I was. Right? It was a good dose of humility for me each and every week. But then I would trust her that if I listened to her and I followed her instruction, I would get better. But then it took perseverance on my part. I couldn't just show up to my lesson each week and be like, come on, do something for me here, Quinn. Let's go. No, I had to persevere each and every day, little by little, until I got to the point where I was. And so that's really what we have to foster. The battle that we have to fight is oftentimes just a battle for humility and faith and perseverance. In my own life, the toughest battle I face is trust and perseverance. I'm not the most humble person, but at least I've stopped praying to win the lottery. Okay, so that's good. The challenge I face now is trusting God's timeline, or trusting that He's doing more than I think He is, even when it doesn't look like it, and trusting my life and the life of my parishioners into His hands. I didn't create this parish. I'm not creating this parish. God's in charge. Okay, so but then the challenge in that trust is then to persevere. That passage you prayed with from Luke is a key part of this. Jesus tells a parable about the necessity of praying always without growing weary, without losing heart. To not lose heart is that ability to keep the composure of heart, we'll talk about next. And these two are just very connected, trust and perseverance. Jesus tells that parable about the necessity of praying always, and then he says, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith? Will he find trust on the earth? Okay, so take a moment to share. Where do you find the battle to be the hardest? And try to share concrete examples from your own life. Here's the billion-dollar question. What's prayer? What is it? Okay, prayer is God's activity. Prayer is something that God does, and we respond to it. When I was at Conception Seminary College, the bestest college in the whole wide world, when I was at Conception, I played on the soccer team there. And the soccer team there was just a motley crew of everyone. We had guys that played college soccer, so they were super good. And then there was guys that could run and kick a ball. That was me. I'd never played soccer in my life. But for some reason, we made it work, and we were pretty good. But when the inexperienced players would start to do stupid stuff, like, a bad call would be made, or the other team would score a point, or you'd be down and you'd start worrying about it, all of us inexperienced players would start trying to do way too much. And we'd start making really dumb mistakes. And so all of the experienced players would yell at us and tell us one thing, just one word. They'd say, composure. Composure. Prayer, again, everything always begins with God. God initiates. God's knocking at the door. We're always responding to something God already started. Prayer is God's work. It is His presence, His voice, to which I respond, to which I attend. There are 101 different methods of prayer. 101, probably 112. So many methods of prayer. But they all have in common one simple thing. They're all trying to foster a composure of our heart. Why? So that we can attend to what God is doing. We start trying to do way too much when all we need is just to compose our hearts, to have this some way of composure so that we can attend and respond to what God is already doing. I love how your faces just tell me everything that I need to know, because it's great. I know how loony this sounds. I know it sounds strange. But think, it's oftentimes a little bit strange because what have you been taught your whole life? Prayer is when I say my prayers. Prayer is when I say my rosary. Prayer is when I go to Mass. Prayer is when I do this. Prayer is when I do that. I do. Prayer is not something we do. God does prayer. We respond and attend to what God's doing. Our girl, Sister Ruth Burrows, she says it. She says this is always the first thing that she has to correct. Again, I plagiarize everything I say. She said this is the first thing she always has to correct with people, is to tell them, prayer is not something you do. Quote, what does she say? Prayer is essentially what God does, how God addresses us, how He looks at us. It's not primarily something we're doing to God, but what God is doing for us. So on our part, prayer is, we're trying to find a method so that we can just focus and attend to what God is doing. The second question that your face is now telling me is, well, what about when I need to ask God for something? Like I need to do that, right? We'll get there, different week. But think of it this way. Again, prayer is our relationship. We've already talked about this. Prayer is our relationship with God. If you are deployed, okay, and your wife is sending you cookies in your little care packages during deployment, that's awesome, right? And you send her a little note back like, hey, those cookies are great, send more. Cool. But if you were given the option, a package every day full of homemade cookies, or your wife, which one would you want? Hopefully your wife. Hopefully you want the person. I would rather be with my wife than get care packages of cookies. It's the same thing with God. God wants to give us gifts. When we ask God for things, there are things God wants to give us. God loves to send us little care packages of cookies. He does. But if we want those care packages of cookies more than we want God, we're backwards. We have something we need to work out first. In our life of prayer, if the first thing we're looking for in prayer is how do I get God to give me care packages of cookies, we've missed the point entirely. We want God. We talked about this last week. We want God. Once we have him, we don't really care about the cookies anymore. But we need to experience that. I know that. I'm not dumb. But we need to experience that first. So this is what prayer is. Prayer is something God is doing. Augustine told us, you were within God. I wasn't paying attention. You were already there. But prayer is something God's already doing. We need to learn to have a composure of heart and to attend to that. But what we want to develop, and we want to start today, is to develop a practice of prayer. What the tradition is called a practice of prayer. You call it the rule of prayer. There's different things that it's been called, but it's just this practice of prayer. And we want to implement that in our life. Again, when I was at Conception Seminary College, bestest college in the whole wide world, when I was there, day one, they gave us a very well-structured, methodical, draconian method and practice of prayer. Every single day, 6:45 a.m. to 8 a.m., we were in the chapel. And while we were in the chapel, there would be some prayers and things we would say, like the Liturgy of the Hours, but the majority of it was just spent in silence. During that time of silence, we could, read from the Bible, we could read spiritual reading, we could do many, many different things, but every single day, 6:45 to 8 a.m., in the chapel, that's what we were doing. And we didn't really have the option. We had to be there. And like if you didn't show up, that wouldn't go well for you. And when you started to complain about it and tell the monks, I'm really not getting much out of this. I think I should just not do this much anymore. They would just smile and say, just keep going. But what was it? The practice of prayer is simple. It's picking a time, it's picking a place, it's making a commitment, and then it's finding something to nourish that time of prayer. That's all that it is. So what I'm asking you to do, I don't know if you know Lent starts on Wednesday. Do you know that? Now you do. Lent starts on Wednesday. So for the 40 days of Lent, I want you to, before you get there, so this is what you need to do for the next 3 days. Before you get there, for the 40 days of Lent, I want you to implement a practice of prayer daily in your life, which looks like, first, picking a time. Mornings work great for people. Sometimes it's in the night, but you know your life, okay? But you need to find a time. Okay, find a time and then put it on your calendar. The second thing you need to do is pick a place. This is the step that everyone loves to skip. They're like, well, wherever I am, that's where I'll pray. Nope. Pick a place. A place that I love to pray since I drive so much now is the monastic cell that's called my car. Right, like if I'm in my car for an hour and a half a day, pray. There's no distractions. Just got to turn the what's it called? The stereo off. Boom. It's a beautiful time to pray. But you need to find, some of us will just put a little corner in our room, put a little statue there or an icon, put a little candle there. Perfect. Anything. You need a place, concrete place. The third thing you do is you have to commit to it. I'm not going to wake you up like the monks woke us up, but you have to make that commitment to it. Just do it, as Nike tells us. And then the fourth thing is to find a nourishment for your prayer. Okay, I want you to pray for put 20 to 30 minutes on your calendar. It's like the first 5 minutes, you're going to just take the time to stop thinking about your grocery list. Then you'll have some time. But 20 to 30 minutes. But we need something to nourish that time. So for example, the daily readings from the Mass. Or grab a Bible and you can read through a book of Scripture for Lent. Some people will also find just good spiritual reading. If you need suggestions for that, let me know. We have a lot of books out there too. But the reason we do that is because, and you don't have to read the whole time, but the reason we do that is because if you're just sitting there with your own thoughts, about minute 6, you're going to start thinking about the Chiefs, and that's not going to be helpful. So a nourishment for our prayer is helpful because it helps to focus and attend, again, to what God is doing. The reason we did this at Conception Seminary College is because what slowly but surely started happening is, even though the first 4 weeks were super painful, by about the 5th week, we had learned a composure of heart and could attend to what God was doing. And we began to have a true experience of prayer. Not because I did something, but because I finally got out of my own way enough that I could perceive what God is doing. That's true prayer, is when we start to get there. Okay, so that's my encouragement during this Lent, to make that commitment in humility, in trust, and then in perseverance. That's the big one, is to commit to a practice of prayer daily with those 4 little steps. Because from there, that's when we'll begin to have those true experiences of prayer. And once we have that sort of an experience, once we experience God himself, everything else in our life of prayer will begin to change. The American mentality is the Nike mentality. Just do it. And yes, when it comes to the practice of prayer, we have to make a commitment to just do that. But prayer in its essence is all God. When we say prayer, we use that word in a bunch of different ways. Again, prayer isn't the action of me doing something to get God to notice me and pay attention to me. That's not what it is. But the distinction, if we want to be precise, the distinction is between true prayer and our methods of prayer. Okay, so prayer, true prayer, the experience of true prayer is something God does and God gives. A method of prayer, and there are 101 different methods, a method of prayer is what I do on my end. To use a really bad analogy, it's the analogy that you see every time you start one of these videos. True prayer is like the internet. Okay, the internet is the reality. We don't make it, we don't do it. It's the internet. A modem or a router, your computer, your phone, that's like our method of prayer. It's how we tap into the internet. The internet's there. We don't need a way to get in. We just simply need a way to get in touch with it. I hope that makes sense, but that's the distinction we have to keep in mind. True prayer and our methods of prayer. So true prayer is all God, but we need a practice of prayer. I think I've shared that before. I learned this first from my dad. Every morning he would wake up very early to have time to pray down in our living room. And he would always have a book or something he was working through. So again, it's those 4 things. There was a time early in the morning. There was a place in our living room. He made the commitment to do that every morning, and he had something to nourish this time. I also remember my grandpa. Okay, when my grandpa would visit, I would often find him outside, sitting on a chair, cup of coffee and a cigarette in one hand, and a rosary in the other. So again, the 4 things. In the morning, outside on a lawn chair, every morning, rosary in hand. So just talk about these 2 things. 1, how did this exploration of prayer and what prayer truly is help or challenge you? And then 2, how are you going to begin or further develop your practice of prayer? Okay, I'll see you next week.